There's a number that Russia doesn't want you to know, not the battlefield casualty figure that gets reported in Ukrainian military briefings and contested by Russian state media. A different number, more fundamental, more revealing. The number that tells you not what happened last week on the front line, but what is happening to Russia's ability to fight this war at all. The number came out of a classified damage assessment session conducted by Russian military command in the third week of May 2026. Not leaked, not published, not confirmed by any official source, but known through the specific channels that produce knowledge of things that governments try to keep secret. The number is this: Russia's effective combat power, where the specific combination of trained soldiers, operational equipment, adequate ammunition, and functional logistics that produces battlefield capability, is at 61% of what it was at the beginning of 2024. Not 61% of what it was in February 2022 when the invasion began. 61% of what it was 18 months ago. Russia has lost 39% of its effective combat power in 18 months, during a period when it was supposed to be winning, during a period when state media was reporting tactical advances, when the narrative was of a Russian military grinding Ukraine down through superior mass and staying power. 39% gone in 18 months. And then Ukraine's all-out offensive began, and the losses got worse. Here's what the current battlefield damage assessments actually show. Here's what Putin's spring offensive ended in. Here's the specific disaster that the numbers reveal. And here's why the Russian military that existed at the start of this year is not the Russian military that exists today. Stay with me. Let's establish what Putin's spring offensive was supposed to accomplish, because understanding the intent is what makes the failure legible. Russian military planning for spring 2026 had specific objectives: consolidate and expand the Donetsk territorial gains from 2025, apply pressure on the Zaporizhia front sufficient to prevent Ukrainian forces from repositioning toward Crimea, demonstrate to the Russian domestic audience that the special military operation was achieving results, and, the objective that shaped everything else, create the conditions for a diplomatic settlement that locked in Russian territorial gains before the cumulative effects of economic and military pressure produced irreversible strategic deterioration. Those objectives required the Russian military to achieve specific battlefield results. Take Chasiv Yar. Expand the Avdiivka salient westward to the next urban defensive line. Apply sufficient pressure on the Zaporizhia front to fix Ukrainian forces there and prevent the redeployment we described in the all-out offensive video. The offensive began. The pressure was applied. Russian forces attacked along multiple axes in the Donetsk region with the concentrated combat power that Russian doctrine calls for. And then three things happened simultaneously that the offensive's planners had not fully accounted for. Ukraine's deep strike campaign hit the logistics infrastructure that was supposed to sustain the offensive. Transfer points, fuel depots, railway junctions, struck at the specific moment when the offensive was drawing most heavily on the supply system. Ukraine's all-out offensive on the Zaporizhia axis forced exactly the redeployment of Russian reserves that the Donetsk pressure was supposed to prevent. Russia had to choose: sustain the Donetsk offensive with the reserves it had available, or commit those reserves to the Zaporizhia axis where Ukrainian forces were advancing toward the Crimean land bridge. It couldn't do both. And the electronic warfare coverage and artillery rates that Russian offensive doctrine depends on were degraded from months of targeting. The guns were firing less. The EW was covering less. The offensive that was planned for a military at 100% of its 2024 capability ran into reality at 61% of that capability. The result, the offensive didn't fail because it was stopped by Ukrainian defensive capability alone. It failed because the Russian military that executed it was not the Russian military that planned it. Let's put specific numbers on what Russia has lost in this offensive period, because the open source intelligence community, the analysts who track Russian equipment losses through drone footage, satellite imagery, and frontline reporting, has built a picture that is more detailed and more damaging than any official assessment has captured. Main battle tanks. Russia has lost more than 3,500 tanks since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022. Approximately 400 of those losses occurred in the spring 2026 offensive period alone. 400 tanks in one offensive. To put that in context, the United States Army has approximately 2,500 M1 Abrams tanks in active service. Russia lost the equivalent of 16% of the entire active American tank fleet in one seasonal offensive. Armored fighting vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and other tracked and wheeled armored vehicles that transport and support Russian ground forces. More than 600 A4A, 600 Ranger AEAF losses in the same period. Artillery systems. Russia's artillery advantage, the sustained massive artillery fires that have been the primary driver of Russian tactical success throughout this war. Equipment losses from Ukrainian counter-battery operations. More than 180 artillery systems destroyed or abandoned in the spring offensive period. And here's the equipment loss that matters most for Russian offensive capability. Electronic warfare vehicles. The specific platforms that provide battlefield jamming, communications disruption, and the electronic protection that Russian ground forces depend on. More than 40 EW platforms destroyed in the spring offensive period. The loss of EW platforms is compounding. Each EW platform destroyed creates a coverage gap. Each gap allows Ukrainian drones to operate more freely. Ukrainian drones that operate more freely hit more Russian armor. More Russian armor hit means more Russian equipment losses. The cycle accelerates with every EW loss. Let's talk about the people, because equipment losses are countable and visible. Human losses are harder to quantify and harder to acknowledge. Russian casualty figures are contested. Ukrainian official estimates are higher than Western intelligence assessments. Russian official figures are lower than anyone outside Russia believes. But the convergence of multiple independent assessment streams, Western intelligence, Ukrainian military intelligence, Russian open source reporting, and the specific demographic signals that appear in Russian social data, points toward a range. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has suffered between 400,000 and 500,000 killed and wounded. In the spring 2026 offensive period alone, the period we're discussing, the estimated Russian casualties run between 45,000 and 65,000. 45,000 to 65,000 human beings, killed or wounded, in a single seasonal offensive that achieved none of its primary objectives. Let's put that in context. The United States suffered approximately 58,000 killed in the entire Vietnam War. Spanning 11 years, from 1965 to 1975, Russia suffered a comparable number of casualties in a single season. And here's the specific quality dimension that the raw numbers don't capture. The casualties in the spring 2026 offensive were not drawn equally from Russia's military capacity. The Russian units that were committed to the offensive were the units that had been assessed as most operationally capable, the most experienced, the best equipped, the units that had performed best in previous operational periods. Those units absorbed the losses. When experienced units absorb 30 to 40% casualty rates, which is what the spring offensive produced in the most heavily engaged formations, placement personnel are not equivalent. The man who has 3 years of frontline experience, who has survived multiple engagements, who knows the specific operational rhythms of his unit and sector, he cannot be replaced by a newly mobilized recruit from a Russian city who received 8 weeks of training. Russia is replacing experienced soldiers with inexperienced ones, and the effective combat power continues to fall. Let's be analytical about that 61% figure. 61% of effective combat power at the beginning of 2024. That 61% is not uniformly distributed across Russian forces. The units in the most heavily contested sectors, the Donetsk axis, the Zaporizhia axis, have suffered proportionally higher losses than units in other sectors. Those units, the ones that matter most for the specific operational objectives that Russia has been trying to achieve, are operating at effective combat power percentages that are lower than the Army-wide 61%. Some of the most heavily engaged Russian formations are assessed at 40 to 50% of their 2024 effective combat power. What does 40 to 50% effective combat power look like operationally? It looks like a battalion that should have 31 tanks, with 14 operational tanks, with the other 17 destroyed, being repaired in a queue that the maintenance crisis means takes months, or simply abandoned on the field. It looks like an artillery battery with 6 guns firing at 4 guns worth of ammunition because 2 guns are non-operational and the supply of shells is insufficient for 6-gun rates anyway. It looks like a company of infantry that should have 100 soldiers with 60 because the others are casualties not yet replaced, and of the 60 remaining, a disproportionate number are the replacements who arrived in the last 6 weeks and haven't fully integrated into the unit's tactical procedures. This is what Russian units on the critical axes are actually operating as, not the formations that appear in Russian order of battle documents, not the formations that Russian state media describes as advancing on Ukrainian positions, hollowed formations with structural weakness that is visible in their operational output and in the artillery rates, the advance rates, the counterattack capability that we've been tracking in previous videos. 61% Army-wide, lower in the critical sectors, and falling. Here's the specific dimension of the spring offensive failure that military logisticians are describing as a disaster in the technical sense. The logistics. Russian offensive doctrine is artillery heavy by design. You suppress the defender with massive fires. You create the physical and psychological conditions that allow infantry to advance. You sustain that suppression with continuous ammunition resupply that maintains the fires throughout the operation. That doctrine requires logistics that work. In the spring 2026 offensive, the logistics didn't work. Ukraine's deep strike campaign had been targeting Russian logistics infrastructure for months before the offensive began. Transfer points, fuel depots, railway junctions, all struck repeatedly. When the offensive began drawing on those logistics at the rates that a major push requires, the system's degraded throughput became operationally decisive. Russian artillery units that needed 1,000 shells per day to sustain the suppression fires their advance required were receiving 600 to 700 shells per day. That gap, 300 to 400 shells per gun per day below the operational requirement, meant the suppression was incomplete. Ukrainian defenders who should have been fully suppressed weren't fully suppressed. They could shoot back. They could observe Russian movement. They could call their own fires. And Ukrainian fires, including the long-range precision strike systems that have been degrading Russian rear area infrastructure throughout this confrontation, hit the Russian logistics even during the offensive. The offensive was drawing on the logistics system. At the same time, the logistics system was being struck. A logistics system that is simultaneously being consumed by the operation it's supposed to support and struck by the adversary it's supposed to enable defeating is a logistics system that is failing in real time. That's what happened to Russian logistics in the spring 2026 offensive. Failure in real time. The offensive ended not because Russian forces were stopped at a specific defensive line and pushed back. It ended because the artillery that was supposed to enable the advance ran out of the ammunition to sustain the fires that made advance possible. Here's specifically what Ukraine did that turned Russia's offensive into a disaster, not defensive fighting alone, something more sophisticated. Ukraine executed a counteroffensive shaping campaign simultaneously with defensive operations. Standard military doctrine says, when defending, you conserve resources. You fight from prepared positions. You make the attacker pay the maximum cost for the minimum gain. Ukraine did that, and more. While defending against the Russian offensive in Donetsk, Ukraine continued running the deep strike campaign against Russian logistics. The specific targeting logic, the Russian offensive creates a logistics demand spike. Russian supply chains are running at maximum throughput to support the offensive. That maximum throughput creates identifiable patterns. More trucks on more roads, more rail movements, more activity at transfer points. More activity means more visible signatures. More visible signatures mean more targeting opportunities. Ukraine's targeting system identified those opportunities and exploited them. Ukrainian long-range strikes during the Russian offensive period hit 23 specific logistics nodes that were visibly elevated in activity due to the offensive's supply demands. The timing was deliberate. Strike the logistics when the operational demand on it is highest. The impact of a disrupted transfer point is greater when the offensive needs maximum throughput than when it's maintaining a static defensive posture. Ukraine struck Russian logistics at the worst possible moment for the logistics. And simultaneously, on the Zaporizhia axis, where the all-out offensive we described in previous videos was underway, Ukraine was forcing Russian command to make the impossible allocation decision: send reserves to sustain the Donetsk offensive, or send reserves to stop the Zaporizhia advance. Russia tried to do both, failed at both. The Donetsk offensive ran out of steam without the reserve reinforcement that would have sustained it. The Zaporizhia advance continued without the reserve interdiction that would have stopped it. Ukraine presented Russia with a dilemma it couldn't solve and executed both sides of the dilemma simultaneously. Here's the specific military capability dimension that raw equipment and casualty numbers don't capture. Officers, specifically, the loss of experienced officers at every level of Russia's command structure. Russia has lost a documented number of senior officers, generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, that has no parallel in any previous conflict in the post-Cold War era. The open-source intelligence community has confirmed the deaths of more than 600 Russian officers at the rank of lieutenant colonel and above since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, including at least 12 generals killed in action. 12 generals. The last time any military lost 12 generals in a conflict was World War II. But the general officer deaths are the visible part, the documented part, the part that makes it into international reporting. The captain and major losses, the company and battalion command level where operational military effectiveness is actually generated, are less documented and more catastrophic. Russian company commanders typically have 2 to 3 years of service before being entrusted with command of a 100-man formation. Russian battalion commanders typically have 8 to 10 years. Russia has been running through company and battalion commanders at a rate that exceeds the pipeline's ability to produce qualified replacements. The replacements, the officers who are being given command because the previous commander became a casualty, don't have the experience, don't have the specific knowledge of their unit, their sector, their adversary that operational effectiveness requires. The qualitative degradation at the tactical command level is not visible in equipment counts or casualty figures. It's visible in outcomes, in operations that don't achieve their objectives because the planning was flawed, in tactical movements that create unnecessary exposures because the commander doesn't know how to read terrain the way his predecessor did, in unit responses to contact that are slow because the commander hasn't internalized the decision cycles that experience provides. Russia's officer corps has been systematically depleted by 3 years of the most intense ground combat in Europe since 1945. The replacement officers are not equivalent, and the effective combat power keeps falling. Here's the domestic dimension that makes the losses even more politically significant. Russian state media has been reporting the spring 2026 offensive as proceeding successfully. Tactical gains are highlighted. Ukrainian losses are emphasized. The specific language of forward progress, of advancing Russian forces, of territory being liberated, that language has been the consistent framing of Russian state media throughout the offensive period. Meanwhile, the actual military results, none of the primary offensive objectives achieved. Chasiv Yar not taken. The Avdiivka salient not expanded to the next defensive line. The Zaporizhia front not stabilized. 45,000 to 65,000 Russian casualties. 400 tanks lost. A logistics system that failed in real time. An effective combat power that declined further from its already degraded 61% baseline. The gap between what Russian state media reported and what actually happened is wide. It's not unprecedented. The gap has existed throughout this war, but it's wider than it's been before. And the people who can measure the gap most precisely are the ones most directly affected by it. The families of the Russian soldiers who died in an offensive that achieved nothing. The Russian military bloggers who can't maintain the fiction of success when their audiences include the families of those soldiers. The commanders who wrote the after-action reports that described the disaster in language that never appeared in state media. Russia's information environment is sophisticated, but it is not impermeable. And the specific social dynamics of large-scale casualties, the families who know, the communities that have lost people, the networks of personal connection that carry truth through a society that has suppressed official truth, are at work in Russia right now, processing a disaster that the official narrative says didn't happen. Let's do the honest accounting. What does Russia actually have left after the spring offensive disaster? Artillery capacity reduced. The shell production constraints we've documented in previous videos. The transfer point strikes that reduce throughput. The artillery pieces lost in counter-battery operations. Russian artillery can still fire. It can't fire at the rates that made it the defining feature of Russian tactical doctrine. Armored capability degraded to the degree we've described. 3,500 tank losses, from which Russia has been drawing on Soviet-era storage, fielding T-62s and T-54s alongside modern systems. The armor that remains is a mix of modern systems in declining numbers and ancient systems that create maintenance complexity and training challenges. Infantry, numerically still significant. Russia has continued to recruit contract soldiers and has mobilized additional personnel. The numbers are there. The quality is not what it was. Electronic warfare, degraded by the specific component shortage crisis we described in the Something Simple video. Running on reduced serviceability rates, creating gaps in coverage that Ukrainian drones are exploiting with increasing effectiveness. Missiles. Iran's supply of Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, which has been a significant supplement to Russian strike capability throughout this war. Is now under pressure because Iran itself is under military and economic pressure in the Hormuz confrontation. The supply that Russia has been depending on from Tehran is less reliable than it was. Russia still has capability. Let's be clear about that. But Russia's capability is at 61% of what it was 18 months ago, after a spring offensive that produced the losses we've described, and still falling. Here's what the front line looks like after the spring offensive ended in disaster. The Donetsk axis. The Russian offensive that was supposed to take Chasiv Yar and expand the Avdiivka salient has stalled. Russian forces are on lines that are not meaningfully different from where they were before the offensive began. The casualties paid to reach those lines, 45,000 to 65,000, produced no strategic change. The Zaporizhia axis. Ukraine's all-out offensive continues. Russian reserves that were pulled from other sectors to address the Ukrainian advance are there, but fighting against Ukrainian forces that have momentum, intelligence support, and the compound advantage of months of shaping operations. The advance toward the Crimean land bridge is ongoing. The northern Donetsk axis. Ukrainian forces in this sector have used the distraction of Russian offensive commitment in the south to make incremental advances in the north that Russian state media has not reported, but that commercial satellite imagery and signals intelligence have documented. The Dnieper crossings east of Kherson. Ukrainian forces who have maintained a bridgehead on the eastern bank have expanded their presence during the period when Russian forces were committed to the offensive elsewhere. All four fronts tell the same story. Russia committed to an offensive that failed, paid massive casualties, achieved no significant territorial objectives, and in doing so, created the conditions, the distraction, the reserve depletion, the logistics strain that Ukraine's all-out offensive is now exploiting. The spring offensive was supposed to create the conditions for Russian success. It created the conditions for Russian disaster. Here's where the spring offensive disaster connects to the diplomatic track. Putin's spring offensive was, in significant part, a negotiating move as much as a military one. The specific calculation demonstrate continued Russian offensive capability to Western interlocutors who might be pressing for negotiations, show that Russia can still advance, create the impression of momentum that makes a negotiated settlement, frozen lines, Russian territorial gains preserved, attractive to partners who might otherwise support Ukraine's drive toward complete liberation. The offensive was supposed to demonstrate Russian staying power. It demonstrated the opposite. A Russian military at 61% effective combat power that pays 45,000 to 65,000 casualties To achieve no significant territorial objectives in a spring offensive is not demonstrating staying power, it's demonstrating exhaustion. And exhaustion changes negotiating dynamics, not in the way that Russia hoped. Countries that have been calculating Russia's staying power, that have been weighing whether to continue supporting Ukraine or push for a settlement that locks in Russian gains, are updating their assessments. The assessment that Russia can sustain its offensive capability indefinitely is no longer supportable. The spring offensive disaster is the specific data point that undermines it, which changes the negotiating dynamic in Ukraine's favor. If Russia cannot sustain offensive operations, for the spring offensive disaster reveals a Russian military that is at 61% effective combat power and declining, then time is not on Russia's side. Time being on Ukraine's side changes what Ukraine needs to accept in any negotiation. Ukraine doesn't need to accept frozen lines that preserve Russian territorial gains, because Russian military capability to sustain those gains is degrading. The offensive that was supposed to strengthen Russia's negotiating hand weakened it. Here's where Putin sits after the spring offensive disaster. He launched an offensive that state media framed as proceeding successfully. It ended in disaster that state media cannot fully acknowledge. His military is at 61% effective combat power and falling. His strategic objectives, the territorial consolidation, the Zaporizhia front stabilization, the diplomatic pressure, were not achieved. His alternative strategy, or the Kaliningrad pressure on NATO, the Suwalki Gap threat, is degrading as Kaliningrad's supply situation deteriorates. His economic position and the $60 billion quarterly deficits, the declining oil revenues, the industrial constraints, is worsening. His regional ally, Iran, whose confrontation with America has been a secondary benefit for Russia by distracting American attention and raising oil prices, is reaching a point where that confrontation may end in Iranian capitulation on the nuclear program. And on Victory Day, the day he used to display Russian military power, there were no tanks. Putin's strategic position is not collapsing. He controls a nuclear power with significant resources and a population that has not yet reached the threshold of active political resistance to the war. But it is deteriorating on every dimension simultaneously: military, economic, diplomatic, regional, and the spring offensive, the operation that was supposed to demonstrate that Russia could still impose its will on the battlefield, produced the specific documented casualty-heavy, objective-failing disaster that we've described in this video. The disaster that is worse than imagined. Because Russia imagined it could hide the true scale of what happened. It can't hide it anymore.